There we go. So we're looking at this early section, um, the middle section of chapter 2 here, beginning from that was when people had begun to feel really sorry for her. People in our town remembering how old Lady Wyatt, her great aunt, had gone completely crazy at last, believed that the Griersons held themselves a little too high for what they really were. We've got a couple of important ideas in this opening couple of sentences. That old Lady Wyatt going completely crazy, the great aunt of Miss Emily, gives us the suggestion that madness is genetically predisposed in the Grierson family, and that Emily has a certain propensity to become insane, judging by the history of her family. But then also this definite sense of resentment at the family's sense of social superiority, that the Griersons held themselves a little too high for what they really were. There's definitely a sense of resentment on the part of the narrator, and then also the town and the community that the narrator represents. None of the young men were quite good enough for Miss Emily and such. I think the phrasing there gives us this sense of that resentment, but shows how she's trapped by her family's sense of social superiority. She is alienated and isolated as a result of this particular sense of socioeconomic superiority that's really driven by her father. We'd long thought of them as a tableau, Miss Emily, a slender figure in the white in the background. This final section of the paragraph is an example of that ekphrastic description, that type of description that is engaged when a writer represents the process of interpreting and understanding something aesthetic or artistic. A famous example of which is Ode on a Grecian Urn by Keats. Here, the narrator is describing the Grierson family as if they are themselves an artwork, and he or she explicitly tells us this when she says, "We had long thought of them as a tableau," as if they are in this frozen moment of a sort of aesthetic representation. The location and the status and the way that each of the people are described in this tableau is really important. It tells us a lot about the family and the way that they interact with each other. Miss Emily is a slender figure in white in the background, and there's this sense of her being insignificant, I think, through being described as slender and of innocent, really, in the background. I think when we question the extent to which we feel sympathy for her, I think this type of description is useful to argue the case that we should as readers, even though she ends up committing a murder. Her father is a spraddled silhouette in the foreground, so he's got his legs spread. But importantly, as we discussed in class, the idea that he is a silhouette gives us the sense that he's kind of faceless. We don't really know who he is, and that his actual identity and personality is not particularly important. Important, though, is the fact that he's in the foreground. He is the one dominating the scene, and he has his back to her, and he's clutching a horsewhip. So even though he is supposedly looking out for his daughter's best interests by refusing all these suitors, he's got his back to her. He's not really paying attention to her and her needs. It's just a simple case of his own desire for domination. And I think that description of him clutching a horsewhip gives us this sort of dominating sense in his image, whilst being distant from his daughter at the same time. The two of them are framed by the back-flung front door. And so, at that moment in time, they're framed by the house itself, but it's as if, as one of our students brought up in class, that this door frame becomes like the frame of a picture. And again, that then shows us, fits in with that pattern of imagery in this story that describes Miss Emily as being some kind of aesthetic representation, a statue, an idol, and here a tableau that's framed by the house, that she is not given the full chance of being an individual human being, but it's seen as a sort of fascination, a museum piece. So when she got to be 30 and was still single, we were not pleased exactly, but vindicated. There's a really sour sense of schadenfreude from the narrator, that pleasure in someone else's suffering, and taking pleasure, I think, in Miss Emily's isolation, because I think it reveals the fact that the level of resentment that the town feels towards the family. Even with insanity in the family, she wouldn't have turned down all of her chances if they had really materialized. There's an enormous sense of skepticism about this, but they're still seeing her through the lens of the old values of patriarchy, that she is only valuable and valued by this town, through her romantic connections. Because here, they simply can't believe that she would at any point turn down a suitor if they had realised, because that is, after all, the only thing, according to this narrator in this town, that gives meaning to the lives of women. When her father died, it got about that the house was all that was left to her, and in a way people were glad. And so she's trapped in this house that is this sign and symbol of economic superiority and of the past. But here, she's trapped by that. She's required to live there and required to remain aloof. But that superiority is only a visual symbol, really. There's nothing underpinning it. There's no means to maintain this life and the economic superiority that it suggests. But people are glad. At last they could pity Miss Emily, being left alone in a pauper. She'd become humanized. So there's a failure to connect with her because of her economic superiority, and now that they are able to pity her, they're able to see her as a human being. And so there's enormous element of hypocrisy from this town that wants to memorialize her and freeze her in this standing of superiority, and at the same time can't relate to her as a human being when they do so. And so here, it's only the chance to pity her that gives them the chance to actually see her as a human being. Now she too would know the old thrill and the old despair of a penny, more or less. And I think this joy in her descent keeps her trapped and alienated, and that the town is definitely complicit in the loneliness that in the end becomes the motivation for her desperate attempt to keep hold of Herman Baron by killing him. The day after his death, all the ladies prepared to call at the house and offer condolence and aid, and again we've got that sense of gentility that I think Faulkner consistently represents as being false and feigned. As is our custom, Miss Emily met them at the door, dressed as usual with no trace of grief on her face, that she is in absolute denial. She told them that her father was not dead, and this is precisely Stockholm Syndrome, where you have an attachment to your captor, an irrational attachment to your captor, which in this case is her father, and that irrational attachment results in her denying the present and denying reality. There's simply too much at stake for her in her father's existence for her to freely admit that he's no longer there. She did that for 3 days, with the ministers calling on her and the doctors trying to persuade her to let them dispose of the body. Just as they were about to resort to law and force, she broke down and they buried her father quickly. And so here, it's grief dominating her. Grief dominates her, again, just before they have to resort to law and force. The grief, in the end, allows her to bury the body, and the town to bury the body. We did not say she was crazy then. We believed that she had to do that. We remembered all the young men her father had driven away, and we knew that with nothing left, she would have to cling to that which had robbed her, as people will. And so the town, I think, encourages her to cling to the past and her father, who's robbed her of the chance to marry and to be, in some fashion, fulfilled and independent. And that, again, the town believed that she must cling to this illusion of her father's being alive, and as a result they are complicit in her isolation and her alienation and her eventual becoming a murderer. And they describe her, they knew that with nothing left she would have to cling to that which had robbed her, as people will. That throwaway remark at the end is quite important because it seems to represent the process as being entirely normal. And then we see in the beginning of chapter 3 the introduction of Homer Baron. And we're in that moment of her father's death in 1893. She was sick for a long time. When we saw her again, her hair was cut short, making her look like a girl, with a vague resemblance to those angels in coloured church windows, sort of tragic and serene. So again, this religious imagery crops up as in a description of her that shows us, I think, that they worship and constrain and alienate her with this attitude. She's tragic and serene. She's both calm and aloof, but also tragically lonely and tragically isolated as a result of this. The town had just let the contracts for paving the sidewalks, and in the summer after her father's death, they begun work. And I think the work itself is a, a sign of modernization and of technological advance and of change. You know, the sort of change that Miss Emily represents a resistance to is precisely these sorts of differences that in the end means that these are the differences that she is unable to adapt to and to make sense of herself. And it's an interesting irony that it's a person who represents change and being an outsider and being different that she attaches herself to. I think that tells us an awful lot about her feelings, about the type of life that she's led, and perhaps her discomfort with that. It is Homer Barron, a Yankee, a northerner, a big, dark, ready man with a big voice and eyes lighter than his face. And so his outsiderly status, he's a Yankee. That's the first thing they talk about. He's a northerner, is what's defined first. And he's represented with an enormous sense of power, I think. The little boys would follow in groups to hear him cuss the riggers, and the riggers singing in time to the rise and fall of pigs. There's a sense of power and fascination with him. And pretty soon he knew everybody in town. So he obviously has an enormous amount of charisma. Whenever you heard a lot of laughing anywhere about the square, Homer Barron would be in the centre of the group. There's a deliberate characterization of him as being charismatic and different. And so there's an enormous sense of potential escape resident in his personality, I think. Presently, we began to see him and Miss Emily on Sunday afternoons driving in the yellow wheel buggy and the matched team of bays from the livery stable. And so again, that narrative perspective becomes this sort of gossipy tittle-tattle of the town. And here, just reflecting on what they've seen rather than the significance of it. But obviously the significance doesn't even need to be articulated because it's almost dripping from the lines. The town itself, I think we see in the next paragraph. At first we were glad that Miss Emily would have an interest, because the ladies all said, of course a Grierson would not think seriously of a northerner, a day labourer. And so at first they're looking at this through the values that hold Miss Emily on a pedestal. You know, they resent her for it, but they cling on to seeing her in this way. They want her almost to remain isolated in that sense of social superiority and snobbery. And that her attachment obviously is a problem for them because it proves that it's not quite the case. But there were still others, older people, who said that even grief could not cause a real lady to forget noblesse oblige. And so, you know, there are other people here who said that even in spite of her utter grief and her need for human contact, she would never forget her noblesse oblige, you know, her commitment to class privilege, that she shouldn't marry beneath herself. But the narrator importantly says, without calling it noblesse oblige. So they're not here even willing to admit that that's how they see her. But there's this sort of silent maintenance of class superiority in the way that they understand her, and that is partly what causes her to remain so lonely. But then, at the same time, reveals that huge element of hypocrisy in the way that she behaves, in the way that the town behaves, resenting her for her snobbery and her superiority, without really ever engaging with her and understanding whether it's the case, but then also insisting that it remain the same when they discuss what she does. They just said, poor Emily, her kinsfolk should come to her. And so they kind of close on this outsider figure and keep her trapped and stagnant and framed in the past by suggesting that the only way that she should seek to solve this scenario is by collapsing in on her own family. She had some kin in Alabama, but years ago her father had fallen out with them over the estate of old Lady Wyatt, a crazy woman, and there was no communication between the two families. They had not even been represented at the funeral. So there's an alienation from her own family here, and the quibble that's caused it is over materialistic concerns. But these are the people that the town thinks that she should get in touch with, that she should in some way look for consolation and comfort. And as soon as the old people said, "Poor Emily," the whispering began. So gossip is begun by the older generation that are keen to keep her as an idol of the past. "Do you suppose it's really so?" they said to one another. "Of course it is. What else could—" This behind their hands, rustling of crane's silk and satin behind jealousies, closed upon the sun of Sunday afternoons as the thin, swift clop, clop, clop of the match team passed. Poor Emily. And so there's a really skillful use of imagery in this description here of the town gossiping. There's no individual that's depicted in detail here. It's just the gossipy dialogue of the town. And then these faceless descriptions that almost function like that rhetorical trope that we were discussing before, synecdoche, behind their hands, showing us that physical act is taking place and that gossip is going on. Rustling of crane silk and satin behind jealousies closed upon the sun of Sunday afternoon. So you can hear that kind of, without it being described, people shuttling round behind the curtains, looking out through their windows at her, being really nosy and almost voyeuristic as she went past on the horse. And so there's this taking pity on her as a way of keeping her trapped in the past. They want to feel sorry for her. They want to see what she's doing as reason for pity, rather than as something that they should see as a positive thing in her life. She carried her head high enough even when we believed that she was fallen. It was as if she demanded more than ever the recognition of her dignity as the last Grierson. So what we've got, again, is the town desiring to see what she's doing as something that deserves pity, because they want to keep her both trapped in the past with this sense of social superiority, but also feel pity for her inability to actually genuinely live in that way. So they want to see her as trying to retain a commitment to that way of life and those values, but struggling to do so. The phrasing of this narration, though, "it was as if she demanded," shows us again that this is the town's subjective gossiping vision of what she's doing, and it isn't objective reality, and that the narrator is constantly speaking about her in this fashion. It is as if it had wanted that touch of earthiness to reaffirm her imperviousness. And so there's a contradiction here that I think constructs a completely obvious misreading of her personality. That they're saying as if she's demanding and wanting a touch of being down to earth, just as an opportunity to reaffirm her impervious sort of aloofness, her willingness to stand apart from society and be seen as superior. But what we've got then is a completely subjective interpretation of her behaviour. They're interpreting her aloofness as a deliberate sort of responding to the challenge that's laid down by having to adapt to her life. But there's nothing in the story that proves that that's exactly her motivation. Again, it's just the town choosing to cling on to this interpretation of her behaviour through the lens of the old values of patriarchy and socioeconomic hierarchy that are attendant upon the economy prior to the Civil War and slavery was still operating. Like when she had bought the rat poison, the arsenic, that was over a year after they had begun to say "poor Emily," and while the two female cousins were visiting her. Now, importantly here, this consistent pitying of her obscures the town's vision, and so their petty desires to see her through the lens of sympathy and to see her as failing to cling on to this old value system, an old way of life, actually obscure their view of her. This is a misinterpretation. They don't get what she's really up to. They don't get that she's actually going to kill her lover to prevent him from leaving. I want some poison, she said to the druggist. She was over 30 then, still a slight woman, though thinner than usual, with cold, haughty black eyes and a face the flesh of which was strained across the temples and about the eye sockets, as you might imagine a lighthouse keeper's face ought to look. And this simile describes her eyes and face as if she's been looking out on some blinded light. I think there's a deliberate suggestion of her being unused to the outside world in that description. When she's forced to engage in society, we see her outside a status. She looks as if she's been straining in the light and is utterly stunned by what's going on when she is forced to interact in society. And her lines are really blunt and tunnel vision. I want some poison, she said. Yes, Miss Emily, what kind? For rats and such? I'd recommend. I want the best you have. I don't care what kind. So there's her grim purpose is evident in her dialogue, which again the town fails to notice, and I think the druggist's dialogue is a way of showing that. The druggist named several. They'll kill anything up to an elephant, but what you want is arsenic, Emily said. Is that a good one? It's an extremely strong poison, arsenic. Is arsenic? Yes, ma'am, but what you want, I want arsenic. Again, she has all the power in this dialogue, but there's this commitment to a sort of feigned gentility and politesse that prevents the town from confronting the real motivation for her desire for this poison. The druggist looked down at her. She looked back at him erect, her face like a strained flag. Why, of course, the druggist said, if that's what you want, but the law requires you to tell what you're going to use it for. And so, again, there's this way of deferring the responsibility for this so that they can cling on to this sense of gentility and politesse. But Miss Emily sees through it, I think, and just utterly refuses to do so. She just stared at him, her head tilted back in order to look him eye for eye until he looked away and went and got the arsenic and wrapped it up. So both power and pity are used here to command here, but both are based on her and the town's adherence to old values. The fact that they pity her and the fact that she's seen as superior simultaneously is precisely what allows her to just command this situation. And it's the town's willingness to see her through the lens of these old values that creates both the power and the pity. And it's that prevents them from seeing a murder that's about to take place. The Negro delivery boy brought her package. And so again, it shows the way that it's reliant upon this old economic system of almost slavery in disguise here. The druggist didn't come back. When she opened the package at home, there was written on the box under the skull and bones, for rats. And so there's I think again, a suggestion of her economic superiority over Homer Baron. She's about to use poison that you would use to kill an animal, to kill this man who is an outsider and an economic inferior.